For the abrupt cutoff in the last video. Let's see, I believe, oh, there we go. Good luck. Keep your eyes open in the back of your head, she wrote. I promised her an Afghan silk scarf. Bribery knows no bounds in radio journalism. Hey, yo. Please focus. Thank you. What is the Russian for help I understand? Help I surrender. Where is the Brit embassy? I asked. The Russian for help is pomog? Pronunciation, I'm sorry. Sue responded in her telex shorthand. So there you should not have any trouble. Bye-bye. Ariana had a flight from Frankfurt to Kabul early on Sunday morning. Then it was canceled. Then it was rescheduled and canceled again. It would fly from Rome. It would fly from Geneva. No, it would fly from Istanbul. When I reached Turkey on MEA, the snow was piled around the Istanbul terminal, and delayed was posted beside the Kabul flight designator. There was no fuel for heating in Istanbul, so I huddled in my coat on a broken plastic seat with all the books and clippings I had grabbed from my files in Beirut. My teeth were chattering, and I wore my gloves as I turned the pages. We journalists do this far too much. Boning up on history before the next plane arrives, cramming our heads with dates and presidents, one eye on the third Afghan war, the other on the check-in desk. I pulled out my map of Afghanistan, green and yellow to the west, where the deserts imprison Kandahar, brown in the center as the mountains shoulder their way towards Kabul, a big purple and white bruise to the northeast where the Hindu Kush separates Pakistan, India, China, and the Soviet Union. The border between British India and Afghanistan was finally laid across the tribal lands in 1893 from the Khyber Pass, southwest to the desert town of Chaman, now in Pakistan, a Dust Bowl frontier post at the base of a great desert of sand and gray mountains 100 kilometers from Kandahar. These lines in the sand, of course, were set down by Sir Mortimer Durand and recognized by the great powers. For the people living on each side of the lines, who were typically given no say in the matter, the borders were meaningless. The Pathans in the southwest of Afghanistan found that the frontier cut right through their tribal and ethnic homeland. Of course they did, for the borders were supposed to protect Britain and Russia from each other, not to ease the life or identity of Afghan tribesmen who considered themselves neither Afghans, nor Indians, nor later Pakistani, but Pushtun-speaking Pathans, who believed they lived in a place called Pushtunistan, which lay on both sides of what would become known as the Durand Line. The end of the First World War, during which Afghanistan remained neutral, left a declining British Raj to the south and an ambitious new Soviet communist nation to the north. Emir Amanullah began a small-scale insurrection against the British in 1919, henceforth to be known as the Third Afghan War, which the British won militarily, but which the Afghans won politically. They would now control their own foreign affairs and have real independence from Britain, but this was no guarantee of stability. There's an asterisk, and I'll read it at the end. Reform and regression marked Afghanistan's subsequent history. My collection of newspaper cuttings included a 1978 report from The Guardian, which recalled how the Soviets had spent $350 million, or euros, I'm not sure what the symbol that one is, to build the Solange Road tunnel through the mountains north of Kabul. It took 10 years and cost 200 million currency a mile. Why should they spend 350 million currency on a little-used roadway across the Hindu Kush? The writer asked. Surely not just for the lorry loads of raisins and toil up the pass each day. The answer is no. The Solange Tunnel was built to enable Russian convoys to cross from the cities and army bases of Uzbekistan all the way over to the Khyber and to Pakistan. A nation of peasants relied upon tribal and religious tradition, while only Marxists could provide political initiative. The violent overthrow of Muhammad Daoud in 1978 led to a series of ever harsher Marxist regimes led by Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafsullah Amin, their opposing Parcham, Banner, and Khalq People parties cruelly executing their rivals. Rebellion broke out in rural areas of Afghanistan, and the army, increasingly mutinous despite its Soviet advisors, began to disintegrate. Taraki died of an undisclosed illness, almost certainly murdered by Amin's henchmen, and then, in December 1979, Amin, in turn, was shot dead. An entire Afghan army unit had already handed over its weapons to rebels in Wardak, and there is some evidence that it was Amin himself who asked for Soviet military intervention to save his government. Soviet special forces were arriving at Afghan air bases on the 17th of December, 5 days after Brezhnev made his decision to invade, and it is possible that Amin was killed by mistake when his bodyguards first saw Soviet troops around his palace. So I'm going to return to that asterisk earlier. They would now control their own foreign affairs and have real independence from Britain, but this was no guarantee of stability. The asterisk says, influenced by the secular revolutions of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey and Shah Reza in Persia, Amanullah instituted a series of worthy reforms: an elected assembly, a constitutional monarchy, secular education, which delighted the modern West but appalled the Islamic authorities, who naturally saw in them the end of their feudal, indeed medieval, power. There was insurrection, and Amanullah went into Italian exile. His kinsman, Muhammad Nadir Khan, did not make the same mistakes. He identified himself with the Muslim conservatives and created a dangerous precedent. This, in a country of such disunity, a new and powerful army. He was assassinated in 1933 to be succeeded by his son Zahir. There followed a brief period of democracy, of free elections, and a moderately free press. But in 1973, a coup brought Muhammad Daoud to power. Daoud turned to the Soviet Union for economic assistance, promulgated several liberal laws which found favor in the West. One encouraged the voluntary removal of the veil from women, but his virtual renunciation of the Durand Line led Pakistan, which had inherited the old frontier to the Raj, to close its border. Afghanistan was now ever more dependent on the Soviet Union. So back to where we were. A quarter of a century later, in Moscow, I would meet a former Soviet military intelligence officer who arrived in Kabul with Russian forces. Before the official invasion, Amin was shot and we tried to save him, he told me. Our medical officers tried to save him. More than that I will not tell you. It is certainly true that the Soviet officer in charge of the coup, General Viktor Paputin, shortly afterwards committed suicide. On 27th of December, however, it was announced that the increasingly repressive Amin had been executed. Babrak Kamal, a socialist lawyer and a Parchman Party man who had earlier taken refuge in Moscow, was now installed in Kabul by the Soviets. He had been a deputy prime minister, along with Amin, under Taraki. Now he was the Trojan horse through whom the Soviets could protest that Afghanistan had been freed and from Amin's tyranny. It was below zero in Istanbul's Atatürk airport. There was frost on the inside of the windows. I padded off to the empty check-in desk. There was a pamphlet lying there, a brochure from the Afghan Tourist Organization. Say Afghanistan, and you think of the friendliest country, it said on the back. Say Ariana, and you've thought of the friendliest way of getting there. But the Afghan Tourist Organization had not survived the purges. A thick black crayon had been drawn through the first page in a vain attempt to erase the name of the head of state of the Republic of Afghanistan, Mr. Mohammed Daoud. The word democratic, an essential adjective in the title of every undemocratic regime, had been penned in above the country's name, and all references to the former royal family pasted over. Local tourist officials who had served Daoud and since disappeared suffered the same paper fate. But the brand new Ariana DC-10 arrived in Istanbul before dawn, its Afghan crew still flying with the American McDonnell Douglas technicians who had taught them to fly the aircraft. It was a bumpy, cold flight down to Tehran, the flight's last stop before Kabul. The Afghan crew ate their breakfast in first class before serving the passengers, the friendliest way of getting to Afghanistan. At Tehran's Mehrabad airport, 3 Iranian Revolutionary Guards boarded and ordered 2 middle-aged men off the plane. They went, heads bowed, in fear. The Afghan crew would not reveal who they were. At dawn, we took off for Kabul. Afghanistan was cloaked in snow, in mountain ravines clotted white and black with rock. From 10,000 feet I could see tiny Soviet helicopters turning the corners of the great gorges south of Kabul, fireflies dragging a brown trail in their wake. The airport was now a military base, the streets of the capital a parking lot for Soviet armor. And there were not just Russian conscripts. The new ASU-85 infantry fighting vehicle belonged only to the Soviet Union's top divisions. Many of the soldiers held the newest version of the Kalashnikov rifle, the AKS-74. North of the city, the 105th Airborne Division had quite literally dug a maze of trenches, miles in length, across the plateau beneath the mountains. From a distance, they looked like soldiers standing along the front lines of the Western Front in those old sepia photographs which my father had taken 62 years earlier. Their commanders must have been hoping that this was the only obvious parallel between the 2 military campaigns. When the Russians stopped my taxi, they stared at my passport, frowning. What was an Englishman doing in Kabul? At the Intercontinental Hotel, on a low hill above the city, there was no such puzzlement. The Afghan reception staff were all smiles, discreetly moving their eyes towards the plain-clothes Afghan cops, lounging on the foyer sofas so that guests would know when to lower their voices. The intensity with which men from the KAD, the Khadamat-e-Etalat-e-Dalati, or State Information Services, I hope I pronounced that semi-OL, okay, would watch us with fortunately only matched by their inability to speak much English. There was a snug little bar filled with bottles of Polish vodka and Czech beer, and a large window against which the snow had sprawled thickly. The bedrooms were warm, and the balconies a spy's delight. From mine, room 127, I could look out across all of Kabul at the ancient Bala Hissar fort. One of the fictional Tom Graham's last battles was fought here. And the airport. I could count the Soviet jets taking off into the afternoon sun, and the explosions echoing down from the Hindu Kush, and then the aircraft again as they glided back down to the runways. In wars, I only travel with those I trust. Reporters who panic don't get second chances. Connor O'Clery of the Irish Times had talked his way up from the Khyber Pass through Jalalabad. He was already in the old telecommunications office downtown, watching with an evil glint in his eye as the operator soldered the letter W back onto its iron stem inside the telex machine. Gavin Hewitt, a 29-year-old BBC television reporter, arrived with Steve Morris and Mikey Viney, the smartest crew I've ever worked with, and a battered camera. These were the days of real film, and its wonderful color definition, now lost to the technology of videotape and Jeff Hale. They were also the days of real crews. when a sound man, in this case Morris, and a film editor, Hale, accompanied a reporter into the field. Hewitt had shrewdly found a beat-up old yellow Pugo taxi, its front and back windows draped in plastic flowers and other artificial foliage, behind which we thought we could hide when driving past Soviet or Afghan military checkpoints. For $100 a day, its driver, a certain Mr. Samadali, was ready to break all the rules and drive us out of Kabul. So on the bright, white morning of January 9th, 1980, we set out in our ramshackle Pugo to watch the invasion of Afghanistan. We headed east towards the Kabul Gorge, deep into the crevice at the foot of the Spinghar Mountains. The Soviet Union was making its way down to Jalalabad, and we threaded our way between their great T-72s and their armored vehicles, each machine blasting hot, black smoke onto the snow from its exhausts. And beside the highway, the Afghanistan men watched, their faces tight against the cold, their eyes taking in every detail of every vehicle. They looked on without emotion, as the wind tugged at their orange and green shawls and gowns. The snow spread across the road and drifted at their feet. It was 2 degrees below zero, but they had come out to watch the Soviet army convoy hum past on the great road east of the Khyber Pass. The Russian crews, their fur hats pulled down low over their foreheads, glanced down at the Afghans and smiled occasionally as their carriers splashed through the slush and ice on the mud-packed roads. A kilometer further on, Soviet military police in canvas-topped jeeps waved them into a larger convoy, in which more tanks and tracked armor on transporter lorries raced along the Jalalabad highway. They were in a hurry. The generals in Kabul wanted these men at the border with Pakistan along the Durand Line as fast as they could travel. Secure the country. Tell Moscow that the Soviet army was now in control. We drove alongside them for 16 kilometers, our car jammed between tanks and transporters and jeeps, the young Russian soldiers watching us from beneath their furs and steel helmets. As the snow blew across us, every kilometer, troops of the Afghan army stood on guard beside the dual carriageway, and 8 kilometers out of Kabul, the convoy passed through a Russian checkpoint. 2 Soviet soldiers standing to attention on each side of the road in long splayed coats of dark green. The further we went, the safer we felt. We knew we were heading into danger. We were well aware that the Russians had already been attacked around Jalalabad, but once we had cleared the first suspicious police checkpoint in the suburbs of Kabul, we were, Hewitt fraudulently claimed with schoolboy innocence, merely touring the city. The next military post waved us nonchalantly through amid the convoys. If we had been allowed to leave Kabul, then we must have been given permission to be on this highway. That, at least, was what the Soviet and Afghan soldiers beside the road obviously thought. Who, after all, would countermand such permission? Thank God, we said, for police states. Our greatest concern was the speed we were forced to travel. The Russians moved fast, even their tank transporters overtaking each other at 80 kilometers per hour in the semi-blizzard, sometimes forcing civilian traffic to use the other carriageway, at one point almost crushing our diminutive taxi between a lorry and a tank. All morning there had been rumors of a new battle at Jalalabad between the Russians and Afghan tribesmen. They were pushing armor out towards the city of Herat, close to the Iranian border, and back up towards Ceylon, where a convoy had just been attacked. What the Soviets were representing as a move against counter-revolutionary elements in Afghanistan was clearly taking longer to complete than expected. The American contention that 85,000 Soviet troops had now entered the country from Tashkent and Moscow appeared to be correct. There could have been 100,000. Packed into Mr. Samadali's cramped Pugo, we were recording history. Steve and Jeff sat in the back with Mike sandwiched between them, hugging the cameras between his knees as Gavin and I watched the Soviet troops on their trucks. The moment we knew that no one was looking at us, I'd shout, "Go!" And, and Gavin, he was, after all, the boss of our little operation, cried, "Picture!" At this point, he and I would reach out and tear apart the curtain of plastic flowers and greenery. Mike would bring up the camera, the lens literally brushing the sides of our necks in the front, and start shooting through the windscreen. Every frame counted. This was the biggest Soviet military operation since the Second World War, and Mike's film would not only be shown across the world, but stored in the archives forever. The gray snow, the green of the Soviet armor, the dark silhouettes of the Afghans lining the highway. These were the colors and images that would portray the start of this invasion. A glance from a Russian soldier, too long a stare from a military policeman, and Gavin and I would cry, "Down!" Mike would bury his camera between his legs, and we would let the artificial foliage flop back across the inside of the windscreen. Don't let's be greedy," Gavin kept telling his crew. We all agreed. If we kept our cool, if we didn't become overconfident, if we were prepared to lose a beautiful shot in order to film again another day, then we'd get the story. Above the little village of Sarobi, we stopped the car. Afghanistan's landscape is breathtaking in the most literal sense of the word. Up here, the sun had burned the snow off the astonishingly light green mountain grass, and we could see for up to 50 kilometers east to the Khyber Pass, to the suburbs of Jalalabad, bathed in mists. For the descent to the valley of the Indus was like walking from a snowstorm into a sauna. Hold your hand out of the window, and you could actually feel the air grow warmer. Gavin was literally bouncing on his toes as he stood up by the road, looking across the panorama of ridges and mountain chains far to the north. We could even make out the purple-white snows on the top of the Pamirs. We were that close to China, and we felt, we young men, on top of the world.